Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Freedom First podcast, where we talk about anything politics and economics and its relevance to us Filipinos. For our first episode, we will be talking about trade and globalization. Today, we will be joined by Kristine Alcantara. Attorney Kristine Alcantara is a trade and regulatory reform expert and a trustee of the Foundation for Economic Freedom. She's the founding partner of Legal Algorithm Law and previously established Trade Lawyers Philippines, one of the country's first firms focused on trade remedies. Christine has held landmark liberalization efforts advising on the Retail Trade Liberalization Act, Foreign Investment Act, and the Public Service Act, and regularly counsels Congress, DTI, and multilateral bodies. She served as a senior expert for the EU Arise Plus program and co-authored Momentum, More Reforms for Economic Growth. In 2022, Christine also received the ASEAN Special Award. Welcome, Christine.
Morning.
To start off our discussion, I'm sure you have heard of the many discourses lately regarding the state of the world, particularly in light of Trump's tariff moves. There's been moves to impose a 10% blanket tariff, meaning for every country, and they're especially on China. But recently, because of some de-escalation efforts from both sides, the 145% tariffs have been brought down to now just 30%. The world is wondering what's happening, but before we go on to the specifics, the words globalization and trade often gets thrown around in discourses in columns. Perhaps you could give us an idea first on what is globalization in the first place.
So, so we talk about globalization today, but to anchor it also in the current events, at the heart of it, it's a question of, or it's a discussion on what you call Trump's art of making the deal. But of course, before we know how to make this deal and why are we dealing, we're talking about globalization, which is fundamentally it's the process of increasing interconnectedness and integration among countries, economies, and people worldwide. So at its core, it's actually enabling countries to specialize in producing goods and services where they hold comparative advantages. Like, for example, wheat grows a lot in Turkey, so it makes sense that they would know how to produce it and how to manufacture it and ship it all over the world. They've been doing this since, well, even before Christ's time. So it's good also that there's a bit of expertise in producing goods. And then we can hold that comparative advantage and we expand the market cycles beyond domestic borders. So in a way, if there's specialization, there's economic efficiency. So that's what globalization brings. It's preparing or being a specialized producer in one aspect. So we don't really have to produce everything in our country, which is not a cost-effective way of doing things. So we create a world where supply chains, investment, and of course, labor markets are deeply intertwined. So trade turns this globalization from, let's say, an abstract concept into a tangible flow of goods, services, ideas, and capital. So if you look at it on like on a very granular or something that we can touch, like a famous book, um, The Travels of a T-shirt. One really good T-shirt is actually composed of goods from all over the country, all or several countries. Cotton, based from the US, or you source labor elsewhere. And when you put together the shirt, it's the best possible product that you can produce. So that's what the actualization of trade. And if you make this T-shirt available at a very competitive price to all of markets, that turns globalization.
The follow-up question I have on that, Christine, is this even a recently new development? I mean, the whole concept of globalization, because I've read a certain article from Aeon the other day. It's titled, We Have Always Been Global. The author argues that we have actually never clearly separated our borders in the first place. Um, the author cites the Abbasid Caliphate. The Muslim scholars were translating texts from the Greeks, were using Indian and Persian mathematics in their astronomical studies as well. So, and also of course, in our language, it's never been closely contained in one continent or in one geography, right? It's always been a mixture. However, there's been always a repelling idea that um, there's nationalism, right? There's this idea of a closed border, and then there's this an external force of globalization that's trying to seep in or go out of the country, right? So I wanted to ask, is this even a new idea, or has we have we always been global as the author has expressed?
Yeah. Yes, actually, we've always been global. So, uh, actually, an example is there's this growing trend among the youngsters these days when you actually get your DNA sample, or when you check, you're pretty much, let's say, you're 1% European, you're 10%, or from all over the world. We ourselves are products of globalization, and it's in the food that we eat. It's in the customs. I mean, we as Filipinos, we're a product of multitudes. That in itself, we have always been global. And I think it's in the nature of humans and us to be global. Uh, while we value, of course, national pride, the way that we're, let's say, landlocked, or that, of course, we have certain tribes. For better produce, we have always traded. We have a home nation that we take care of, but we have always traded with others also to get the best of everything. We need the best materials, and the concept of global value chains have actually been there since time immemorial. We have trade routes, and it's actually these trade routes that have led us to discover new land. And in fact, it's led to not just discovery of new nations, but the founding of new cultures, the blending of it. So yes, actually these global value chains have actually shaped world order as we know it, as founded nations and all of that. But of course, the difference is before we just crossing borders for spices. But now it's real time. It's e-commerce platforms. It has become let's see more complicated. So,
Now, Christine, it's a good thing that you emphasize the increasing sophistication of our global trade. And let's dig deeper into that. What is the role that digital tools are playing right now in our increasing interdependence with each other?
actually, digital tools are interesting because it served to accelerate a lot of, or it plugged in the holes for global value chains. For example, before, if you're a small player, you're not automatically connected to these big players. You don't get access to a lot of, let's say, supply chain mechanisms or logistics. It has actually lowered the barriers for smaller players, and emerging economies have have actually been able to plug in into global networks. So, for example, before, if you wanted to import a certain, let's say, you have to import goods, you have to do it by bulk because you have to think of shipping. Now, just think of one thing, and then the next thing it's at your door. It's sometimes even more competitive to order online abroad and then directly from a manufacturer than to actually source it here. Then you pass through a distributor. So it actually reshaped the way global value chains, and with the value of, let's say, of e-commerce, it it actually pivoted the way actual stores, physical stores are set up. It's more of like it's either the good thing, farm to table, but also in the way the bad things also our carbon footprint. So that's also both the good and the bad. So yes, digitalization and digital technologies have really reshaped the way global value chains are constructed and how goods are delivered from one country to another.
You've mentioned that there are good things and bad things about this whole globalization phenomena, Christine. But I guess my question would be then, who tends to usually lose and who tends to usually win when it comes to globalization?
Okay, so it's actually a good topic to delve into. So let's deep dive into that. So of course, trade liberalization, globalization, and I'm very much for it. And there are powerful engines for economic growth. But of course, the thing is, there's also the question of social justice. There's You cannot separate one from the other. And the sad part is, while trade liberalization and globalization, of course, is automatic, yes, the gains and benefits are not, let's say, automatically or evenly distributed. So even if things are global, even if things are liberalized, usually the capital owners skilled workers and, export-oriented sectors and the urban hubs. These are the ones that supply or that's these are the ones that benefit the most because they're deeply integrated into global supply chains. But of course, conversely, let's say a low-skilled worker with no digital, there's not a lot of digital literacy available. Traditional industries exposed to, let's say, import competition, and of course, vulnerable regions that often place displacement and income pressures. Because not everybody is plugged in digitally in the Philippines, of course. So that gap, they're actually also left behind when it comes to when it comes to trade liberalization and globalization. And of course, there's when you talk about liberalization, globalization. This is the most, let's say, debated one. What about social justice? What amount of social justice and social support is needed just to make sure that the benefits are actually evenly distributed?
Now, Christine, let's bring the discussion to the local scene. Even in our own country, for example, we can observe that economists and politicians are often in conflict with each other with regards to the benefits of globalization. Most economists would definitely support globalization, like, for example, in the context of rice importation, which is a very polarizing topic. Most of them would support the country importing more rice since, as you said a while ago, it is more cost efficient. But a lot of our politicians are actually opposed to that idea. Um, I am curious about these conflict. Like, what's the reason why? Do they have different priorities? Like you mentioned a while ago that others are criticizing globalization because of its lack of social justice. Is that the case?
I guess it's more there's always have to be a balance because when you talk about economy, when you talk about efficiency, and you talk about, let's say, aggregate outcomes, it's a bit cold, admittedly. It talks about numbers, it talks about statistics, but when you talk about big picture, you kind of this is where politicians thrive, where you talk about, let's say, micro level political economies, like when you talk about my province or my municipality doesn't get enough support. You talk about urban trade liberalization, but my municipality, uh the workers of my municipality do not benefit because there are no factories, so there are no jobs there. So, but in general, the big picture, it looks good. But of course, there needs to be so it when you don't benefit from trade liberalization, of course you become it's not really like a critique on the person, but it's the situation. You become protectionist. You have trade policies that to safeguard sensitive sectors. So that's why there's always a bit of, even with the WTO, there's a bit of, you look at into agricultural products, because there's always, you have to also balance a bit of equity and social stability for that. So it's quite normal. If you're not plugged in global value chains, you tend to have protectionist measures. And it's if when you liberalize, liberalization is one thing that you open up the economy, but are we ready? Have we actually been competitive? So while getting there, what social justice measures or what opportunities, or have we given people enough capital to start these businesses? So it's always a good discussion. Economists tend to look at it at the big picture, but politicians, hopefully, and mostly since they've just been re-elected, just look at it that how does it benefit like the micro, the farmers, like those who are not plugged in into global value chains.
What I'm getting from what you're saying, Christine, is that it's not really a zero-sum game. I mean, we can always do a balancing act. Perhaps my question would then be, in your plethora of experience in the government, in the private sector, you have experienced some good aspects of where the balancing act is in play. Perhaps you could run us through how those balancing acts happen on the ground. How do we actually balance between opening the sectors and, and pursuing social justice at the same time? An example would be greatly appreciated to guide us in this discussion. Yeah.
So, so let's talk about the big three liberalization laws in the Philippines: Retail Trade Act, the Public Service Act, and uh, so if you focus on those laws, when you think about globalization, you allow investments into what you call utilities, utilities that we need better internet so we get plugged in. We get investments into retail trade, you liberalize retail trade. But of course, when you talk about retail trade, how about those micro or even sari-sari stores? Then you talk about Foreign Investment Act. How about security concerns? So in those three laws, we call the trifecta, the recently passed liberalization laws. There's always a concern of when you open up the economy, let's see, there's like for example in retail trade, there's always been a discussion. Okay, what is the threshold per capita? 10 million. Okay, 10 million and below. These are for sari-sari or sari-sari stores or micro enterprises. And beyond that, okay, let's spice it up a bit. Let's put in some foreign capital so we have access also to other goods. But of course, in that 10 million and below, have we addressed ease of doing business? Have we addressed availability of capital? So when you construct a law like a Retail Trade Liberalization Act, you also give support to those who cannot compete with foreign investments. So you look also to make it also competitive, you give the same access to them. Then we talk about, let's say, the Public Service Act. We need better access or we need better utilities. But of course, when you provide or when you seek investments from foreigners investing to the Philippines, in the law, there was of course, a provision that has to go through security checks. Or the foreign investment coming into the Philippines, it doesn't take away the power, of course, of the Filipinos to determine their own, let's say, economic direction. So that is very, very important. And in the Foreign Investment Act, we open it up to sectors, let's say like renewable energies where we need a little bit of development. But to counter all of that also, do we also put in investment funds or for small businesses to go into what you call sunrise industries, just so that they have access to capital and access to training from the local governments and from also from the trade and industries, just so they can compete. So those are samples. And then one last, I think there was a good discussion, is the Rice Tariffication Act. So Rice Tariffication Act, rice is a tricky discussion because we produce it in the Philippines. Sometimes it's enough, sometimes it's not enough. And with the growing population, we would want to import because we are also thinking of food security on one hand, but on the other hand, we're also thinking, what about our farmers? So just to balance it out, we also have funds for the farmers to improve on their ways of planting rice and gathering. So it's one of those balancing act that we also need to discuss in terms of it's very specific. Sometimes it's specific to the season for agricultural products, and it's specific to industry. So that's an example, of course, that when liberalization, you have to have social support systems. So just make sure there's safety nets, retraining, and community investments to help workers and regions adjust.
From your examples, Christine, I just want to uh, share my thoughts and realization. Um, I realized that from the laws that you have mentioned, we have to perhaps deconstruct what free trade means, because a lot of people normally think that when we talk about free trade, it's free in an absolute sense. It means that we are completely opening our economy to foreign investors or to foreign actors without really giving care to our local industries. But on the examples that you mentioned, it's worth highlighting that our laws are actually making a lot of compromises. we are trying to balance foreign actors and at the same time taking care of our local businesses, our local farmers, so that we we can balance efficiency, cost effectiveness, and also social justice. Now, still, the Philippines, granted, have entered into different trading agreements and even the World Trade Organization in the previous decades. Uh, there will be always opportunities and risks whenever we engage in free trade. Um, are there particular sectors that are more vulnerable to these risks, for example?
Example, agriculture, yeah, I guess, certain sense. Well, of course, there's always be specific sectors that will be more competitive. Like for example, our services, IT, business process outsourcing, and let's say niche manufacturing. So these are opportunities. But on the other hand, we sensitive sectors like agriculture faces import competition can really disrupt livelihoods. That's why in the ongoing debates, in fact, I think in the past 2 years alone, there's been a lot of discussion on agricultural products and import conditions. So, of course, this it just means that the thing about opening up global value chains is that it exposes, let's say, weak sectors in a nation or in society. So for us, when these weak sectors are exposed, the next step is to establish social support systems. So we're not talking about just infusion of capital. We're talking about, okay, infused capital. How do you make them grow? How do you make it sustainable? How do you make it inclusive? How do you really grow a manufacturing industry? How do you grow agricultural system? So of course, you go to land, you free up a lot of property. You help farmers get patents over their land. You help them get machineries, they get access to capital. So those are the things that your social support systems have to also complement the call for capital from abroad. So it's more or less it's also both an opportunity to improve on systems.
Now, let's go to the opportunities. We know that you are a heavy supporter of our local creatives, our artists, and you have pretty much done some initiatives to make them more competitive in the global stage. Can you share it with us?
So good opportunities, like for example, in our creative industries, the government has just enacted the Creative Industries Act. So what that law, like the Startups Act and the Innovation Act has done before that is to help build the ecosystem where creative industries will thrive. So that means the incubators or uh, the distributors or even say even a coffee shop that provides, let's say, co-working systems for creative industries. And it can be subject also to health from the government. So that's also part of the opportunities that when we have competitive advantages, services and industries, then we take it and then we build up the system. So these are the laws that were pretty good for our economy. And other opportunities also include that, of course, when we started or we anchored the discussion in the Trump context, and the U.S. Started, let's say, reevaluating global value chains. Then we look elsewhere. We look if that's not a good deal for us, we look elsewhere. It's not we look also in ASEAN partners, we look at EU partners, which has always been a good trading partner with the EU. We also look how we can strengthen ASEAN more, and how do we look at it also, ASEAN as the consumers. We're how many the Philippines alone 130 million, Indonesia 150, so it's quite sizable as a consumer basis. So they're in a way that uh, the things are both actually we could it's such a challenge to turn these let's say pushbacks into opportunities.
Now, I want to pivot a little bit from the economics side of globalization to a more geopolitical and strategic, because I'm sure in your experience, there has been a lot of talks on strategies or strategic trade policy. I could remember specific instances when we were in FEF were lobbying for certain amendments to the Constitution. Some people who were against it were saying that it could expose us to threats outside the Philippines, basically. And there are recent news, for example, that there have been Chinese rogue communication devices found on solar panel inverters. So I guess my question really would boil to what does strategic trade policy mean in light of this external threats and risks, and how do we even balance them with the economic benefits of opening our borders?
Well, in terms of course, threats, um, the way to mitigate risks or these threats is always to diversify trade partners. Uh, the way that, we're opening up the entire world, we just don't only focus on one portion of the world. You look into different trading partners. We improve our domestic competitiveness. And then we look at policy reforms and how can we, let's say, take advantage of global value chains that have not yet been fully developed. South America is actually a good transaction point with the Philippines. And if there are security concerns over certain countries, then we look also into other let's say supply chain suppliers. So we look into developing other supply chain partners, and we look into trade reciprocity where security is not much of a concern. So it's more of it's really we just need to diversify. And of course, when you talk about diversification, is we have to be also strong as an economy so that we can afford to diversify our partners. But this is the opportunity now. We've been having uh, additional tariffs in Southeast Asia, and our economy has been poised or we've always been in the emerging economies list for the past couple of years. So it's good also that we can learn to go beyond certain countries and our reliance with them.
Now, for context, I because I was reading the news a while ago, and I saw that currently the tariffs that has imposed upon all countries currently stand at a minimum of 10%, while the tariffs that he imposed on China is currently at 30% minimum, which is a good thing, I guess, because it was way much higher the previous weeks. Now, do the tariffs imposed by Trump, do they pose a threat to our current trade system? Uh, do they say anything about the fragility of our global trade?
Yes, it does. Actually, we won't pretend that it won't, but it does. It highlights how, interdependence also creates systemic risk. So, for example, the actions of one colleague can make a ripple globally. And it does affect efficiency and market stability. This is the same reason why when there was a blockage in the Suez Canal, prices rocketed. So it's the same thing that it's also highlights the fragility of our global value chains. Then again, it goes back to how resilient and how diversified our supply chain is. So we will go through another readjustment. So before, it's like similar to there was an incident in Suez Canal. There's a conflict in Europe. So we readjust. We have another structural shift in globalization. It's similar to, let's see, what happened when global value chains were stopped because of the lockdowns imposed during the COVID-19 pandemic. So it does have an effect. And what this tells us is we study how did this affect us. So we are placed at the 10%. Okay, that's good. That means that the US also depends on us for something. So we look at that. We look at why we were given 10%. Maybe because we provide a certain benefit to the US. Are there certain goods that we ship, certain agricultural products that we provide, or certain services that we support? So we look into that, and maybe we can rebalance this. That can we provide more and take advantage of this? At the same time, we know that what if it goes the other way? What if from the 10% suddenly become 60%? How will this affect us? So we also need to diversify. So we just need to be very, very proactive in terms of meeting changes also in terms of globalization, because we're all interdependent. Of course, we have to be, I guess, more efficient in identifying the challenges and opportunities.
Do you think, Christine, that this is a global trend that's just gonna keep continuing, or do
Yeah.
you think that Trump is just a blip in the, the big history of globalization? Do you think we're going increasingly becoming more nationalist in terms of our economic borders, or, you know, maybe you can channel your inner oracle ideas here, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Uh, I don't do but the thing that's the thing with predictions, right? It's we what we can always see for sure is that change will always happen. There will always be ups and downs. But in the end, it's more or less um there will always be shocks. And if we've seen the trend in the past 5 or 6 years, much more so now, because it's shown that, global value chains can easily be disrupted because of one thing. And I think we are at that stage that we have just transitioned from, let's say, a manual global value chain to a digital one. So we're in the still the first, let's say, 20 years. And it's just been upended by the lockdowns caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. And then we had actual wars going on, regional wars going on. So President Trump's calibration, it's more of, if there's a threat, there's always a turn towards nationalism. And it's understandable. You would want to protect your own rather than globalize. But what the uh what economists see, which is a bit cold, but it's true, it will tend to right itself. So if you don't take in to supplement your let's say food security, uh, there will probably either population will source it themselves, they will move, or there's always a correcting factor. And I do hope that we look at this before the adjustment factor tends to affect people already. So in that aspect, there will always be a correction done. And hopefully, when we see those market corrections, it won't be at the expense of actual human lives.
Christine, let's go back to Trump's tariffs and their effects on the Philippine economy, because there are some analysts who say that, um, in contrast to our Southeast Asian neighbors like Vietnam, for example, we're not really that much affected by the tariffs. Is that true? And does it open an opportunity for us to improve our competitiveness, for example?
Yes, actually, the opportunity's been there for the. I mean, it's been there. It's been simmering. We've had very good relations also with the United States even before, and a big part also is the Philippines actually presents a, let's say, a good geopolitical advantage for the US. So that's one. And we have provided a lot of back-end support in terms of services. And we have actually been we have good trading relationship with the United States. So it comes to no surprise also that we have one of the more favorable tariffs with this current administration. But the thing also is, it has always been favorable to the Philippines. So it's a question of, do we take advantage now? I mean, we have not taken advantage in the past. The bigger, I think, the before, when there's a shift of after COVID-19 lockdowns, a lot of manufacturing facilities in China shifted to Southeast Asia. The first one to take advantage of that was actually um, Indonesia and Vietnam, because they opened up and they had, and Indonesia had a good market, a manufacturing base. Have we developed our industries to be ready to take advantage of that? So that's more of the question. It has We have always had that advantage. So now in Southeast Asia, can we get back manufacturing plants back in the Philippines so that we can enjoy better tariff rates? Right now, I think we are pushing hard, but maybe we need to push harder to develop those industries.
For my last question, Christine, since we've been talking about global trade in terms of economics, we've been talking about its benefits and its disadvantages. Now I want to be a little bit more philosophical and personal, perhaps, uh, because I believe that at the heart of free trade is the liberal belief uh, in the individual's freedom to pursue his or her own interests, for example, his or her own dreams, careers, and the business that they want to participate into. Now, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but uh, Trump's tariffs runs deeper than economic benefits. I think it poses a challenge, a fundamental challenge to this liberal value that we have been taking for granted for decades. What can you say about that?
So if we go about, let's talk about, let's go from economics to, let's say, free trade liberalization. But what we see is about, I guess, human condition. Okay. I guess what this discussion is telling us is that freedom is never an abstract, or it's not an isolated concept. It's when you're free, you're also be ground. You have to be grounded in responsibility in community. So we are free to trade, but also we have to take that you have to be grounded when we're trading. Is there enough, or are we also providing enough for our family, for our communities? And when we're trading, is it sustainable? Or like for example, are we trading away all of our natural resources? There's none left to develop nature industry. So it will not be sustainable. So at the heart of any trade or globalization discussion, uh, there's also, I've touched upon, I think there's a lot of need for social support systems. So that what that means for the human person is that human condition is generally, how to seek happiness is basically interdependence. So we need to treat people the best way possible. We need to treat ourselves with dignity. We need to treat our trading partners with dignity, because that's what trade and globalization is about. How do you treat people with with the dignity that is expected or should be commensurate to you being a human being. So that's it. It's I guess individual aspiration with like a collective responsibility. So that's really, if you're going philosophical about it, we're not really free. We're free to the extent of we're really free if we're grounded in responsibilities.
Wonderful. Thank you for joining us today, Christine.
Thank you also for the questions. It's a good way to also understand, like, globalization in terms of not just numbers, but how it affects us as human beings as well.